Wouldn't the world be safer without religion? Nothing to kill or die for, no religion too, as John Lennon famously wrote and sang. I mean, all that violence and conflict in the name of religion. Everyone knows that religion is a major cause of conflict around the world, don't they? Everyone knows, but is it true? Just think about all the major conflicts you've ever heard of. I mean, like the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Korean War, the Crimean War, the Boer War, the Hundred Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, the American Civil War, one of the bloodiest in history, the American War of Independence. It's actually quite difficult to think of more than two or three that even have religion as a major component. And I know that the two that you want me to mention, and I'm coming to those, but do take a look at the bigger picture. The Encyclopedia of Wars catalogued all known conflicts and classified them according to cause, and it turns out less than 7% are attributable to religion, and some historians think that even that is an overestimate. I mean, like, for example, the recent Balkan conflict that clearly had a religious component, but equally a substantial ethnic and political rivalry that contributed and was maybe the main contributor. All the same, 7% is 7% too much, isn't it? But let's just look at the two that always come up when the subject is mentioned and see how valid they are. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Irish Troubles, and the Crusades. Now, the history of the Troubles goes right back to the Norman conflict, when William the Conqueror defeated the Saxon king Harold at Hastings and established his throne in Britain. The Normans just kept rolling right on. They conquered Ireland too and brought Ireland under the British throne, and there it stayed for centuries. The seminal event was probably in 1603, at the end of the 9 Years' War of rebellion against British rule, when the Irish were defeated, and many of the Irish landlords, particularly in the north, fled to mainland Europe for sanctuary. Their lands were seized and settled by Scottish and English farmers who were loyal to the British Crown. The consequence of that was that in 1922, when the Irish Free State was established, the descendants of those settlers were in the majority in the north, and the north elected to remain part of the United Kingdom. But the tensions between the two communities, the settlers and the Irish nationalists, remained. And in the 1960s, they overflowed into violence, leading to the deployment of the British Army and the Troubles. But there are three things that are worth noting here. Firstly, the origin of the Troubles is clearly political. To say that the origin is religious is like saying if those English and Scottish settlers who had been given lands in Ireland had only been Catholic instead of Protestant, everything would have been fine because they'd all have been the same religion. Well, that's clearly nonsense. And then secondly, during the Troubles, the nationalist side identified their own cause as a political one. There was never an Irish Catholic army, there was an Irish Republican army. They identified their cause as a political cause. And then thirdly, what was the solution? What was the thing that brought the Troubles to an end? What was it that enabled the former quartermaster of the IRA, Martin McGuinness, the firebrand Protestant preacher Ian Paisley, to settle their differences, become the best of friends, to laugh so much together they became known as the Chuckle Brothers? Was it a religious agreement? Was it the settlement of their doctrinal differences as Catholic and Protestant? Of course not. The Good Friday Agreement was a political settlement that enabled the two sides to begin to work out their political differences peacefully. And so it should be plain that the origin was political, the cause was political, and the solution was political. And therefore, it should be plain that the origin of the Irish Trouble was not in fact religious, however it was presented in the press, but was fundamentally political. The historian Richard Jenkins in 1997 wrote this, that it should, I think, be apparent that the Northern Irish conflict is not a religious conflict. The majority of participants see the situation as primarily concerned with matters of politics and nationalism, not religion. That's that. So how about the Crusades? Well, obviously there's no denying the religious element to the Crusades. There's no getting away from it. And the Crusades will remain as a shame and a disgrace on the history of the church forever. But was it purely a religious conflict, or were there other elements at play? The Crusades were triggered by an appeal by Pope Urban at the Council of Clermont on 27th of November 1095. But they were bankrolled and the military muscle was provided by the civil authorities and the crowned heads of Europe, who had stubbornly resisted every previous appeal to take action. So what changed in 1095? What was it? Why did the Crusades happen then and not earlier? Europe had been under military pressure for hundreds of years from armies advancing from the south under the banner of Islam. The Byzantine Empire lost Jerusalem in 637 Common Era to the Rashidun Caliphate, and many of its lands in the east followed suit soon afterwards. Even Byzantium itself came under siege twice. Meanwhile, in the west, the Umayyad Caliphate conquered the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, and later armies even crossed the Pyrenees, pushed into what's now France, conquered Aquitaine, and were only held back by the Frankish army under Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers. So Europe, for almost 400 years, has been under pressure, east and west from the south. But by 1095, several things had changed. First, there was a temporary resurgence of the Byzantine Empire, and there was a resettlement by the Visigoth kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, which relieved the pressure on the southeast and southwest gateways to Europe. Secondly, the tolerance toward Christians and Jews that the earlier Muslim rulers had shown started to change, and there was a period of persecution and oppression, of destruction of churches and synagogues, including the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the tomb of Jesus in Jerusalem, which caused outrage in Christian Europe. Then there was internal conflict in the Muslim world, which led to a breakdown in law and order, and Christian European pilgrims came under increasing attack from Bedouin tribesmen and suffered greatly. For example, in 1065, a group of between 7,000 and 12,000 Germans on pilgrimage to Jerusalem came under such severe attack on the way there and the way back that only 2,000 returned alive. And then between 1091 and 1095, Byzantium again came under pressure, this time from the Seljuk Turks, and the emperor made a formal appeal for assistance to Christian Europe. And so we find that in 1095, both religious interests and political interests in Europe became aligned in a way that they hadn't been before. And it's unlikely, in fact, seriously, it's impossible, that the Crusades could have taken place without that alignment of the religious and the political. Historian Paul Chevenden wrote, "Scholars have been asking what devotional religious climate or religious innovation caused the emergence of the Crusades, when they should have been asking what ongoing conflict intensified to the point where it received the highest and most expensive religious warrant." Giving violence religious sanction doesn't excuse it, whether it's war, terrorism, or some other form of violence. But what about state-sanctioned violence against the Uyghurs in China, against the Rohingya in Myanmar? What about right-wing terrorism? What about gender violence against women worldwide? Are we saying that violence somehow is of a different order and somehow worse if it has a religious association? All around the world, every day, hundreds of thousands of people doing good work inspired by their faith and their religion. Wherever you look, in charities, in churches, mosques, synagogues, religious organisations all over the world, you find people feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, housing the homeless, supporting families, and providing education services, mental health support, all motivated by their faith and by their religion. So is religion really such a problem, or is the problem in fact militancy, aggression and violence in all its forms, regardless of the cause? What do you think? Post a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear from you.